let us look at the theoretical perspectives that underline transnational feminism. Firstly, we will look at the concept of coloniality of power. This idea of coloniality of power has been developed by the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Cujado in his article which was published in the year 2000. This article describes the global power structure that emerged after the modern world systems. Modern world systems, so we have to differentiate between modernity and postmodernity and how these modern and postmodern world systems are different from each other. So he wants to describe the global power structures that has emerged after the modern world system. So it is a theory that explains how the legacy of European colonialism continues to impact contemporary societies. So we find that this idea of decoloniality, like transnational feminism, has diverse interpretations as well as sources. So in his work, we find that Anibal has critiqued colonial legacies in power structures, in knowledge systems which become preferential according to the colonial background, and societal norms which have been impacted or fundamentally shifted because of the colonial mindsets. So we find that scholars like other scholars like Maria Lugones and Chandratalpade Mohanty also offer foundational yet distinct perspectives in this background. So, Annibal's concept of coloniality of power is basically a framework to understand the historical and structural interconnections between global capitalism, colonialism, and racial domination. He has argued that the colonization of the Americas has established a new global order which is characterized by racial classification and labor exploitation that have become foundation to the contemporary global capitalism. And therefore, he suggests that the racial domination is not merely a byproduct of colonialism, but it has come to become a critical axis of the new global order also. So,
Uh, Sorry for interrupting, ma'am. There's been some issue with the audio, and the participants have been mentioning disturbing background noise.
okay, so would you suggest that I log out and join again? Maybe there is some difficulty.
Ma'am, it might be an issue with the earphones that you're using. So, still there.
So, is it better?
The audio is better now, ma'am. The
Okay,
noise has. Thank you so much, ma'am.
okay. So, thank you. So I hope that there won't be much disturbance now. I'm sorry for it. Um, I should have tried it earlier. So we find that Annibal has highlighted how the creation of racial categories has served to legitimize exploitative labor practices, associating unpaid labor with colonized races. This racialized division of labor became a core mechanism for maintaining global capitalism. Now, we find that he points out that racial hierarchies are not natural. Rather, they are historically contingent, emerging specifically from the colonial encounter. But these racialized divisions are now strategically imposed to exploit labor and resources. So, what he has suggested is to say that the colonial system has
established a new geography of power. And by the new geography of power, he wants to suggest that the global structures of domination and exploitation have been reshaped in favor of certain races. So this power dynamic continues to underpin the modern world systems even today, and it has not been taken away. It impacts our understanding of issues related with gender also. So Eurocentrism as a worldview became hegemonic only through the colonial expansion within certain centuries. But still we find that even in this age when colonial hegemony has been questioned and has been non-existent, its impact can be felt. And he has identified three core elements of coloniality that affect our lives in a global manner. He talks about coloniality of power, that is the organization of power relations which are based on racial hierarchies. Then he talks about the economic system, which is rooted in the exploitation of the capitalist systems and which is tied to racialized labor systems. He also suggests that Eurocentrism also advocates the epistemic dominance of Western nationality and perspectives, not only in the context of our understanding of relations, but also in the context of our understanding of how different relationships and our perspectives on different issues work. So, Eurocentrism in fact imposes Western knowledge systems, rationality, and cultural norms on the rest of the world. It also means that it devalues and suppresses non European perspectives. So, he further explains that Eurocentrism has homogenized cultural differences. Homogenization of cultural differences has reduced distinct identities to simplistic and racialized categories like Indian, African, or Black. It is interesting to note that what is being suggested by these writers was pre-envisaged by an early 20th century novelist, D.H. Lawrence, who in one of his essays has pointed out that gradually we have culturally universalized certain themes. For example, he has talked about the dress, the preferable food, etc., the preferable fashion. But we find that the more contemporary writers are able to discuss the more dominant dimensions of it also. So we find that this process, which has been pointed out by these three core elements of coloniality, results in the creation of a new technology of domination, or let us say a new technology of exploitation, where race and labor are naturally associated. Now, in this context, it is also important to refer to the work of feminist writers and critics like Chandra Talpade Mohanty, who have called for an intersectional approach combining anti-racism, anti-capitalist, and decolonization. So we find that Chandra Talpade Mohanty has envisioned a feminist practice that acknowledges and transcends the boundaries which have been created by race, class, nation, and culture. So this approach, which has been advocated by Chandra Mohanty, does not advocate for borderless feminism, but highlights the significance of recognizing and working through differences to achieve solidarity. Mohanty also connects feminism with anti-capitalist critiques, arguing that global capitalism further extends inequalities which are based on gender, race, class, and certain other axes of power. So she calls for a feminist practice that opposes neoliberalism and the commodification of women's lives. She also emphasizes the need for solidarity against capitalist exploitation. So instead of talking about the simplistic notion of sisterhood, Mohanty has stressed a reflective solidarity, which acknowledges mutuality, accountability, uh, the recognition of shared goals while respecting diversity. This solidarity is built on understanding and working across differences rather than erasing the differences. Western feminist discourses often assume a universal category of women, and universalization of these categories of women, or for that matter, men or the transgender or any other gender, erases the diversity of experiences. These diversities, which are based on the differences of culture, sociological backgrounds, racial differences, and the class structures, etc. So this homogenization is opposed by theorists like Mohanty, and they advocate for feminist practices that recognize the experiences and also the struggles of women in non-Western context. Because we cannot say that there is monolithic definition of experiences of women. So the monolithic category of the third world woman reduces a third world woman to a singular victim of oppression representing a form of discursive colonization. So women are defined as being continually sexually oppressed, but defining women as archetypal victims who are frozen into objects who define themselves, and to suggest that women are the archetypal subjects who perpetrate violence is against the basic tenets of transnational feminism. Mohanty has also critiqued Huston's 1979 work titled Third World Women Speak Out for its reductive treatment of Third World women as a homogeneous group with similar problems, needs, and goals. An attitude which disregards the class, cultural, and historical context. Huston had focused on women in countries such as Egypt, Kenya, Sudan, Tunisia, Sri Lanka, and Mexico, and had argued that their challenges center on issues like education, health, political participation, and legal rights only. So Chandrakalpate Mohanty attributes these issues to insensitive development policies and suggested solutions such as training women for field work and creating cooperatives so that they can themselves provide solutions for their problems. Mohanty has highlighted the political implications of such representations and has argued that they contribute to the colonization of third world women's experiences by erasing their diversity and positioning them as needing and depending on Western solutions only. Now, let us look at the shared themes across decolonial frameworks. So I have listed here five different themes. The first is attention to macro and micro political structures. The second is historical consciousness and specificity. The third is commitment to liberatory practices and values. The fourth is decoloniality, which diverges from post-colonialism by challenging colonial systems rather than focusing on the after of colonization. The fifth theme within this framework is awareness of the impact of colonization on knowledge systems, epistemologies, and the cultural consciousness of the people. While Cujano's analysis breaks new ground in connecting colonialism with racial domination and global capitalism, it has also been critiqued for its lack of a gender analysis. Mario Lugones, an Argentine feminist philosopher and activist, has extended his work by addressing the role of gender in the colonial project and how it intersects with race and labor. Further. So Mario Lugones builds upon Cujano's work which has focused on structural connections between global capitalism, colonialism, and racial domination. But identifying this gap of gender analysis, she critiques the uncritical acceptance of the hegemonic understanding of gender, which, in her opinion, is too narrow, too patriarchal, and rather too heteronormative. So, according to Lugones, Cujaro's analysis leaves modern notions of gender, sexual dimorphism, heterosexuality, and patriarchal power distributions unchallenged. So, we can say that Lugones extends Cujano's notion of coloniality to include gender as a fundamental axis of power. She emphasizes that coloniality does not just involve racial classification, but is an encompassing phenomenon that permits control over sex, authority, labor, and subjectivity. This analysis highlights how gender and race intersect as tools of colonial domination. It also demonstrates that systems of exploitation, such as unpaid labor, looking down upon the domestic help which is provided by women unquestioningly in several societies, these systems of exploitation are intertwined with racialized and gendered hierarchy. Lugones has critiqued the idea that patriarchy, as understood in Western modernity, is a universal and transcultural concept. So she had also incorporated the work of Oyumi, who argues that Yoruba society did not organize itself around gender before colonization by the West. So we find that several anthropologists like Margaret Mead, etc., have also referred to the existence of various societies before the Western colonization took over and has suggested that the fluidity of gender norms was practiced in those societies. So we find that against this homogenization, the more contemporary aspects of feminist criticism, the transnational feminist critics argue. They also suggest that the modern colonial gender system has emerged as part of the colonial project because it has erased the plurality of gender norms which existed earlier in various colonized societies. So, alongside global capitalism and racial domination, this is also an aspect which we have to look at. She points out that the understanding of gender has imposed during colonization, which is deeply tied to colonial modernity. For example, in our own country, we can say that the attitude towards the transgender has been shifted legally only during the times of the British colonial era. So, by addressing the colonial roots of modern gender systems, Lugones has provided tools for analyzing how gender oppression intersects with race and coloniality. Lugones' work fundamentally reshapes feminist and decolonial theory, and she insists on the interconnectedness of race, gender, colonialism, and capitalism. She argues for the importance of rethinking traditional concepts of gender, labor, and power within this decolonial framework. She has also integrated her critique with the broader discourses of feminist theory, pushing it to consider histories of colonization and the resulting epistemic violence. At this point, I think we have to refer to Kimberly Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality also, with which I think all of us are very well familiar. So, very briefly, I can say that Kimberly Crenshaw was the first critic who systematically highlighted the oversimplification which leads to the exclusion of women of color whose experiences are shaped by the interlocking dynamics of race, gender, class, and other types of systematic oppressions. So Crenshaw has critiqued identity politics for ignoring intra-group differences leading to political and social inequalities. Her work had stemmed from the attitude of the police forces and the law enforcement agencies, uh, which was different to women of different races. So she has illustrated how immigrant women, particularly women of color, are uniquely vulnerable not only to the domestic violence but also to the systematic ignorance by the law enforcement agencies of this violence due to intersecting barriers. And here we have listed some barriers, but the list is rather long. So, dependence on spouses for legal or cultural information, threats of deportation by abusive partners, and also the language barriers because still there are various societies in which the education of women is not in the priority list. So Crenshaw has also suggested that categories like Weber or Asian need not be stripped of all meaning, but rather they should be viewed as sites of agency and potential coalition. So she looks at identity as being flexible and also as being coalitional, which offers the potential for subordinated groups to negotiate the meaning of their identities actively. For instance, policies or interventions that focus solely on domestic violence or racial justice often fail to address the specific needs of women of color who experience these forms of oppression simultaneously. So we can say that Crenshaw has identified intersectionality as a framework to mediate the tension between multiple identities and has highlighted the necessities for group politics. So she had argued that the categories which are created by power structures are not inherently problematic, but rather they have to be reclaimed by the subordinated groups. So she also brings it to our notice that home can be a confinement and exclusionary situation as well as a coalitional space. So therefore, her argument in favor of liminality also becomes important. Intersectionality has been instrumental in critiquing the hegemony of white middle class feminism, which often centers on gender at the expense of race, color, and other oppressions. And this framework underscores that gender oppression cannot be addressed in isolation but is entwined with other systematic forces of domination. In this context, we have referred to the work of Linda Smith. She has talked about epistemic violence. Now, this epistemic violence, in her opinion, refers to the harm which has been inflicted through systems of knowledge that devalue indigenous ways of knowing and being. For example, this internalization by various citizens of erstwhile colonies that their indigenous ways of knowledge are somehow not as important as the Western ways are. So, Linda Smith has critiqued how research methodologies which are rooted in Western traditions have historically marginalized indigenous knowledge systems and they have been treated with a certain inferiority or they have been treated as non-existent. In India, we often refer to the diary entries of Macaulay, who had introduced the British system of knowledge in India, but at the same time had been very effectively able to erase the erstwhile systems of knowledge. So this process of creating this inferiority or to suggest that the erstwhile knowledge systems do not exist is tied to imperialism, where the colonizer's epistemology is imposed as being universal, the only ideology which is considered as justifiable, etc. So Smith also critiques the methodologies which have been used by anthropologists and other Western researchers who have historically treated indigenous people as merely objects of study rather than as knowers with valid epistemologies. This approach dehumanizes indigenous communities and perpetuates the colonial power dynamics embedded in the production of knowledge. Indigenous spiritualities are also presented as sites of resistance against epistemic violence. Smith has explained that Western systems of knowledge have often sought to discredit or appropriate indigenous spiritual beliefs. Spirituality, in her opinion, represents a critical contrast between indigenous epistemologies and Western epistemologies, offering a unique challenge to dominant frameworks. It is only now that the erstwhile colonies have started to work towards gathering their earlier research epistemologies and their own ideologies. Particularly, we find the significance of spirituality being talked about by the Western critics also in their narratives of caregivers. The word itself, research is probably, sorry, this is a quote from Linda Smith and I am reading it out. So the word itself, research, is probably one of the dirtiest words in the indigenous world's vocabulary. When mentioned in many indigenous contexts, it stirs up silence. It conjures up bad memories. It raises a smile that is knowing and distrustful. It is so powerful that indigenous people even write poetry about research. So we find that this systematic erasure of the differences, of the plurality of knowledge systems has also impacted when we look at the issues related with gender. So Smith here has connected epistemic violence to the history of imperialism. And uh, it was fine for the Western powers because they needed this approach to legitimize their own control over various other cultures and countries. But at the same time, we find that the asymmetrical power relations that have influenced knowledge production also require decolonial strategies to reclaim indigenous epistemologies. So her work calls for a decolonization of methodologies, urging researchers to respect and integrate indigenous knowledge systems rather than imposing Western frameworks only. And this requires a fundamental shift in terms of how knowledge is produced, valued, and disseminated further. So we can say that Smith's analysis extends beyond academia, right? It touches on how epistemic violence reinforces global inequalities and it also exposes the colonial underpinnings of Western epistemology. So she has advocated for epistemic justice and emphasized the need to recognize and empower indigenous voices. Another aspect which we often talk about in the context of our understanding today of transnational feminism is to understand relational ontologies. It is a key aspect today when we talk about transnational feminism. So we find that relational ontology is a core concept within indigenous philosophies and it emphasizes the interconnection and interdependence of all beings, including humans, animals, plants, land, and spiritual entities. And therefore, we find that the ties which we have between the transnational feminist ideas and post humanistic angles is related with it. So, relational ontology in indigenous thought challenges the Western dualistic frameworks that separate human from nature, that talk about the superiority of human being, and a practically a let's say an isolation of everything which is not human. However, we find that in indigenous philosophies, relationality defines existence, where beings exist not as isolated entities, but through relationships with others, including non-human and spiritual entities. For example, the conventional Indian belief, which respects different natural resources, which deifies the rivers, the water, the earth itself, is an example. So, in indigenous epistemology, knowledge is not an abstract pursuit as it is in the Western philosophy. Rather, it is a practice which is embedded in relationships. It is contextual. It requires listening, attentiveness, as well as deep observation, rather than limiting itself to the Western idea of skeptical critique or testing everything. Because we can not always talk in terms of absoluteness. The, the subjectivity is also a part of our understanding of issues. So, indigenous knowledge frameworks reject the subject object dichotomy which is common in Western epistemologies. Instead, knowledge is done with, not on, other beings in relationships. So, after having talked about all these aspects which are important in transnational feminism today, let us also look at this idea whether it is really relevant today. Are we still talking about it in such a way that it is going to impact our day to day issues? So we find that neoliberalism has widened the gap between the global north and the global south, exploiting labor and resources in the south while benefiting economies in the north. So, in latest research trends, in the way in which AI and robotics, the data, is being assimilated and disseminated, certain countries are being denied access to data, which impacts their policy making, which in turn also impacts our understanding of gender. These issues become much more important today, particularly in marginalized communities. Women face precarious labor conditions, limited access to health care, and economic instability. So, transnational feminists critique neoliberalism for commodifying women's labor is important because it obscures structural inequalities. And therefore, increasingly restrictive immigration policies and nationalist movements also marginalize refugees, migrants, and women of color. And it is in all these contexts that our understanding of transnational feminist issue becomes significant. So, feminism, especially transnational feminism, offers a determined response to post truth policies, arguing for the role of imagination, creativity, affect, and fiction also in countering post truth. Feminist epistemology challenges the binary opposition between objective truth and relativism instead of reinforcing one truth or no truth at all. Transnational feminism offers a space beyond these extremes, promoting epistemic dialogue and solidarity. Feminists argue that knowledge practices should be creative, contingent, and imaginative, as opposed to rigid systems of truth. And this approach can transform politics and also contribute to building solidarities capable of challenging post truth. So, transnational feminism reminds us that struggles for justice are always deeply interconnected. It also offers us the tools to challenge systematic inequalities without erasing the specificities of lived experiences in different contexts. It also fosters global solidarity, which is grounded in mutual respect and accountability. It also rejects the universalization of narratives, an aspect which we have discussed in detail, ensuring that feminism remains inclusive, adaptive, and responsive to local as well as global systems of power. So, transnational feminism, we can say, reshapes solidarity from a static idea of sisterhood into an active practice of engagement, accountability, and co creation. And therefore, it bridges differences while respecting these differences and respecting the boundaries so that the collaboration becomes meaningful and possible and sustainable in the long term. As global challenges like gendered violence, climate change, and economic inequality, economic insecurity persist, transnational feminism provides a theoretical and practical framework to address these crises through shared resistance, collective agency, and transformative action also. So, as we conclude today's lecture, we have explored the complex and transformative
My
nature
microphone
of
is.
transnational feminism through various disciplinary lenses by recognizing the interconnectedness of gendered struggles across the globe. We see how transnational feminism forces us to rethink traditional boundaries of knowledge and power moving towards, let us say, it's essential to continue questioning of things. It's questioning of how our individual and collective work can contribute to a more inclusive and equitable global feminist framework. So I would stop here and would like to take any questions or listen to the comments of people.
She's asking.
So I would stop sharing and how do we stop sharing? So we have discussed some very foundational aspects related
And
to
no, I think it has given enough food, uh, for thought for these participants. And I request the participants to come forward and to, if they have some questions, they can put it in the chat box. Or if they want to directly, posit some questions, they can come forward. I mean, you all can raise your hand and get in. We'll let you in. So, and ma'am, we have shared the tutorial prompts to the students.
yes,
So if there are no questions now, there is a question in the chat.
yeah. What is the role of third world in South Asian feminism in this regard?
Hmm.
Is it? Uh, this is the question, I think. Okay. So we find that firstly, what we understand as third world, it also requires certain attention. So we find that in different societies, particularly in the context of gender, there are different norms and different feminist approaches are also needed. What is important for us to understand in the context of transnational feminism is to ensure that these, say, homogenization processes are denied and the need for different types of agentic action on the part of women is recognized. So we find that I do not want to presume what are the countries which are putting in the third world, but let us say that in South Asia itself, different societies require different types of approaches towards action. So The transnational feminist ideas alert us to this duality. They make us sensitive to this idea that a single strategy would not be workable for different societies. So the role of different types of feminist movements remains to be very important. It is important in every country to look at the historical context and then to fight it out. For example, there are countries in which the legal system favors women and allows them to participate equally in different fields. But at the same time, there are legal systems which deny even the basic right of education to women. So, in all these types of societies, we find that the feminist movements are going on in different ways because what is the contemporary need in a society is to be realized and talked about by the concerned people only because they understand it better. The role of transnational feminism is not only to alert us to the different requirements of women in the context of activism, but also to provide an understanding help. And that is why we find that this idea of active sisterhood is to be practiced. If you can be more specific about a particular type of, let us say, third world or South Asian feminism, then it would be easier for me to elaborate on it. So I have given a very journalistic response to your question.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for wonderfully responding to that. And this is an oft-asked, question. So I would request you, ma'am, that if you can project your tutorial prompts over here,
Okay,
the participants can just have a look and we can give them a 15 minutes break so that they can contemplate on it. And then the floor opens for interaction. So we have
okay,
been practicing this methodology, this pedagogy for the last 2 days. So we'll do it today as well.
okay. So I find that there are one or two more questions. There's the one from,
Yes.
let us say, a person from psychology, and then regarding the nomenclature, feminism itself. So would it be okay if I take them right now or I
Absolutely,
will
absolutely.
giving the tutorials? Okay. So let's look at the first question. This is whenever focusing on research, most of the theoretical framework is borrowed from the Western perspective. So, how can we manage balancing the largely Western theoretical background with the unique psychological experiences of women across the globe, especially those navigating the challenges of caste, race, and economic balance? So, first of all, we have to understand that the issues facing women in a different society are unique. And then we have to look at what type of indigenous critical framework is there. What country are you talking about? Is there any critical framework which has been non existent? Was it there earlier? If not, then we have to build it from scratch. For example, uh, if you can name a particular country, then you have to go back to the historical research methodologies which perhaps have perished because of the onslaught of the Western colonizing powers. At the same time, I would not suggest that we have to reject the theoretical framework which has been developed in the West because we find that it is a wonderful critical perspective in many ways. For example, what we understand as gender had also started in the West only because in our own country, like for example in India, women were busy in fighting against the colonial empire. So we find that the Western concepts are not to be rejected, but we have to look at in such a way as to complement it. And also, we have to ensure that a particular perspective is not, applied to the subjects under study without an empathetic reassessment of our tools. Whether the theoretical framework which we have adopted from the West is suitable to the cultural and societal requirements of that particular section of study or not. When we talk about the Western frameworks, we also cannot say that it is unanimously monolithic. So, which Western perspective? So, we have to be objective, particularly as a researcher. So, I would also suggest that if you can ask a more specific research question, then perhaps I can give you a better structured answer. The second question was about the nomenclature of feminism itself. Considering that the discourse as well as the practice is moving towards indigenous ontologies, points of view and knowledge systems, how appropriate it would be to have a terminology which is an ism. The suffix is rooted in a totalizing, essentializing, hierarchical Western epistemological worldview. Well, my answer may also be incorrect, I would say. Now, how do we respond? I'm basically a person of language, so how do we understand the meaning of the word? So, we find that the lexical meaning is perhaps never enough. We also have to look at the connotative meanings. And ism, to my mind, is not a final thing. For example, we can take up feminism, we can take up Marxism, modernism, postmodernism. Do we have a single definition? No, we don't. So, to my mind, ism, whenever we use ism, whether it is feminism or any other ism, it provides us a comprehensive umbrella term, and that is all. Within that umbrella, we find that the pluralities exist. The word feminism is rooted in the Latin root, as all of us are aware. But at the same time, our understanding of feminism itself has evolved gradually. We often say that we are moving into and across as far as the geographical locations are concerned. But do you think that even in the Western imagination and Western critical thought, it has retained the similarities which there were about 100 years back? So things change, definitions change. What is important for us to be aware that any attempt towards universalizing human experience is wrong from the perspective of a research scholar. A researcher has always to be aware of the pluralities which exist and shape our vision. And within these pluralities, what can be the most objective notion? So we find that we cannot use any term like an agenda to present global women problem, etc. So there is nothing like a single and unique global women problem, except a very loose way to put it across that women often face inequalities, right? But when we try to define it further, we find that the pluralities come into our mind. So you will find that the connotations of the words are never static. So you can look at this idea of this suffix, okay, in a particular way, but I think that there is enough scope for pluralities. So there is a third question also. Now I'll read it aloud first. I have a question. It's a part of my research where I'm trying to work on women bodies in digital era across space and culture and beyond one particular geography. I want to understand, as I have faced some challenges while structuring my paper, is it very significant to narrow it down to one particular geographical location, especially when my agenda is to present global women problem? I am not sure if it's making sense. So I presume that you are a research scholar, right? So you are talking about, as if your process of research. So you will find that the presentation of women bodies in digital era is important because the digital literacy or its lack or its availability or non-availability are questions we are facing. But then as a researcher, now there can be two different ways of answering your question. For example, either you can narrow it down to a particular geographical location. Okay, because you cannot talk about global women problem as a research scholar The very idea of research is to go deeper, to become narrower so that the specificities can be answered and analyzed. So when you try to become specific, you have different possibilities. Either you can talk about the representation, let us say the digital representation of women in a particular geographical location and what are the related questions. Or you can take up the responsibility of media, so on and so forth. So there may be diverse ways of looking at it, but as a person who has worked in this field of research, I would say that research has to be specific. It has to go deeper. It has to be very specific. But being specific does not mean that you negate other existing possibilities. But you have to argue why are you proposing a particular approach. So you will find that when we look at it further, decolonization of knowledge systems would also require us to embrace local languages, which is more appropriate words for understanding indigenous knowledge systems, having both oral and written traditions and multiple dialects eventually leading to multiplicity. How do we ensure global connection in such cases of multiplicities while ensuring local solidarity? A very interesting question. A question to which I do not have a very clear answer. But whatever I would say in answer would lead to further complexities in this question. So you will find that there are local languages, there are local dialects. And these local languages and local dialects are a product of our socio-cultural geographic environment. Often you would come across this idea that a person who is living in Alaska has 20 different words for ice, whereas a person who is living in desert would not understand the finer distinctions and vice versa. It is true. But then ultimately, we find that the digital demand is to translate it into a language which can be understood. So, are languages actually translatable? You would find that while in my work on, let's say, while I was working on my projects about IT, robotics, gender, etc., so we ran into certain difficulties. For example, when we try to challenge certain language, when we try to translate into English languages in which the genders are not specific, then a Google Translator works in such a way that automatically the conventional gender roles become highlighted. So you will find that, okay, I'll continue this discussion. Rather, I would take up this question as a beginning point of my tutorial. So thank you so much.